Hello, and welcome to CultureCast. I'm Alicia.
I'm Jenna.
I'm Lindsay.
I'm Aaron.
I'm Olivia.
Today we will be discussing the novel Persepolis, the story of a childhood, which tells the graphic events of the Islamic Revolution from the eyes of a young rebellious girl named Marjane. Before we dive into the details of the novel, let's discuss some information about the author.
Okay. Marjane Satrian is an Iranian-born French graphic novelist, illustrator, film director, and children's book author, born on November 22nd, 1969. She is a writer and director, which is an impressive feat. To Iran, however, she is not. Her novels were actually renounced by Iran. She also owned the newest model of Nikes during a cultural revolution, so basically she's pretty much a badass.
Her most famous works are the Persepolis series. Persepolis is a memoir of her life. This book is set in the 1970s and 80s in the Iran-Iraq War. It was also the time of the Islamic Revolution, which has been described as the most significant event in Iranian history. During this time, Reza Shah was overthrown and an Islamic republic was voted into government. This forced the people of Iran to conform to the Islamic religion.
The form of the book links to the historical context by showing it from a child's honest point of view. The book explains the revolution extremely well so that people of all ages and education levels may understand it. It links to the cultural context by giving us vivid illustrations of the extreme events occurring in Iran during this time. Margie's childish illustrations actually teach us something without even knowing it.
An important aspect of the book is the aesthetic elements. A major one of this novel is the use of only black and white. This portrays Margie's childhood as an overall bleak and ominous one. It also shows the anonymity of the citizens of Iran during the Islamic Revolution, when the government violently forced them to dress, think, and act a certain way.
Next, we will discuss Iran versus the rest of the world. Most people view Iran as a country that is against America and American culture. Persepolis puts into perspective that Iran is usually stereotyped to be that way because it shows what it is like to grow up in Iran. But in reality, they are people just like everyone in this classroom.
It shows that no matter where you go, you can always be misunderstood based on where you come from.
That's very true. And along with being misunderstood amongst different countries in the world, people in your own country can misunderstand you as well. This is prevalent when we analyze the social roles of the different characters in the novel.
We first begin to see a development of social roles in the letter chapter when the maid of Marjane's family, Mary, begins to develop a relationship with a neighbor. Mary could not write, so she asks Marjane to write letters for her to send to the neighbor. When Marjane's father catches the two, he tells Marjane to stop. Marjane erupts in anger after her father tells her, "You must understand that their love is impossible." When Marjane asks why, he tells her that in this country you must stay within your own social class, and leaves the room shortly after Marjane begins to cry and asks herself, is it her fault that she was born where she was?
I agree with Marjane. Just because someone may be considered less fortunate than you does not mean that they are not equal or their emotions are invalid. In order to express this, Marjane then goes to Mary's room and states that they aren't in the same social class, but at least they were in the same bed. This was a powerful panel because it shows the reader that the sympathy Marjane and the younger generation as a whole have for the failing Iranian social class beliefs.
This is just one instance of social roles in Persepolis. Another time we see this is as the war progresses, the Iranian army begins to recruit youth and teenagers from the poor social class, promising them gold houses and all the women they could want in paradise, or the afterlife. The Iranian army are using their power to influence the young soldiers into joining their army without giving them an actual idea of how the war will truly be.
Adding on to that, as the story continues, we see all social roles begin to fall apart and come together as one, as the Iranian regime becomes more totalitarian. In the Jewels chapter, we see Marjane and her mother go to the supermarket to get food, and they get into an intense argument with another woman of a lower social class, trying to buy the same thing. Also, Marjane and her mother, as well as all women, are being forced to clothe their entire body, even the upper class.
Okay, since we are already talking about some major points of the novel, let's discuss the characterization throughout the plot of Persepolis. Marjane is the main character and author of the book. In the beginning of the novel, she is portrayed as a very bright young child who follows in her parents' footsteps with regards to views on the revolution. However, as the story progresses, we see Margie grow older and start to develop her own views on life. She is a rebellious girl who challenges the Islamic Revolution.
Margie's parents, Ibi and Tashi, are very progressive people who protest against the revolution. Ibi is a photographer and documents the revolution. Taji is the most emotionally strong character out of the three of them.
Speaking of close family, let's discuss Margie's grandmother and uncle. Her grandmother is her source of comfort and nurture when all the terrible things of the revolution are occurring and her parents are protesting. Her uncle Anush serves as a hero to Margie during the dangerous and heroic things he did, including rebelling against the Shah, running the USSR, and attempting to come back to Iran and being thrown in prison for 9 years.
And let's not count out Mary. Mary is Margie's maid, although she is essentially a part of their family. Margie considers her a sister. She so desperately wants to be a part of Margie's social class, which is evident when she falls in love with the next-door neighbor. So clearly all of the characters in the novel add a different but extremely important aspect to Margie's life growing up.
Let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, feminism. This book has been categorized as a feminist story in this class, but more specifically, liberal feminism is the main form in the story. The women of Iran are obviously being oppressed by being forced to wear veils and having certain liberties they once enjoyed taken away. But we see no action from the majority of them. Marjane herself fades away from joining the feminist cause and instead prefers to attend the rallies for Iranian independence.
This is also evident throughout Marjane's life. As we can see, her feminist gender roles begin to be oppressed, as well as all the women of Iran as a whole. Shortly after the Shah was overthrown and the Islamic Republic established, women were being forced to cover their bodies in veils and robes. The panels in the Trip chapter represent this perfectly. Marjane's mom is seen running down the street after coming close to being raped by 2 other men. The next panel shows a man making a decree on TV that women must cover up to avoid becoming raped.
Another example is the military telling newcomers that upon death, paradise will contain houses of gold, food, and women for them. Immediately after, Marjane's mother responds, "Woman," obviously still in shock from the attempted rape on her. These first 2 examples exploit the natural male gender roles and the opposition to the feminist movement.
This book is hard to compare a real-life first-hand account to another book as a whole because the story it tells is one of a kind. However, we can compare some feminist elements of The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood to Marjane's story. Towards the ending of the book, there's about 10 panels that show Marjane wearing a denim jacket, a Michael Jackson button, and the newest model of Nike shoes. As she is walking home from a CD store, she runs into 2 women wearing robes and veils, which she explains are members of the women's branch to the Guardians of the Revolution. Marjane explains her role is to find and bring in women who were improperly veiled and dressed.
This is very similar to the military dictatorship in the United States that Offred lives in. Both Offred and Marjane live in essentially totalitarian regime states that are centered around a religious belief. Just as the ants in The Handmaid's Tale are tasked with telling women their only purpose is to serve men of the Gilead, the women from the Guardians of the Revolution bring Marjane into the committee to be arrested. Both of the Guardians of the Revolution and the ants in the 2 books establish their authority of women in the country to ensure none of them begin to show any traces of feminism in society.
Next, we will discuss value judgments within the text. Marjane makes judgments on the values of many different types of people throughout the novel. Marjane values justice and allegiance to her count. For example, Marjane did not agree with the fact that her friend's father participated in the police of the Shah's regime and killed millions of people. Although this may have been exaggerated, Marjane valued the allegiance to her country and believed in getting justice for those who lost their lives. Therefore, she threatened her friend by putting nails between her knuckles and wanted to attack him like Americans with their brass knuckles.
Marjane also did not agree with the torture tactics the Iranian soldiers manipulated in order to either punish Iranians or get information out of them. She did not believe that these people deserved to experience such harsh consequences, especially because she and her family knew many victims of the tortures and thought that they deserved to be treated with justice and respect.
There are many prevalent themes within Persepolis. An important one is the loss of innocence. This can be seen multiple times throughout the storyline of Persepolis. Once is when Marjane decides she's going to smoke a cigarette. She decided that being able to smoke a cigarette meant that she was now an adult and was mature enough to handle more aspects of the war and issues going on around her. She is 12 but somehow considers herself an adult.
Loss of innocence appears again when the Shiite attempt to convince poor young boys to enter into the army in order to receive honor and essentially have many luxuries in the afterlife. The audience sees here the corruption of the government in the youth. The war will also cause these gentlemen to see many violent images. If they are able to survive, they will have ultimately lost much of their innocence along the way.
Another important theme is modernization versus tradition. This theme is prevalent throughout the entire novel. Coming from a Marxist family, Marjane and her family often desired to live their own lifestyle and not that of the Iranian government or the lifestyles of the people in Tehran. In one instance in particular, Marjane's parents traveled to Turkey for a few days. While they were there, they bought many modern items for Marjane that were prevalent in the 1980s in America, such as a Michael Jackson pin, a jean jacket, Nike sneakers, and 2 posters of Iron Maiden and Kim Whittle. This act of modernization was met with conflict, as Marjane's parents had to figure out how to get these new modern items across the traditional men running customs.
If they found any of these items, Marjane's parents would receive punishment. However, Marjane's parents are smart and hid them in her father's jacket, making it look like he had square shoulders while getting onto the plane.
Iranian women wearing veils is another example of the theme of modernization versus tradition. Marjane is very conflicted when it comes to this aspect of government ruling. She knows that wearing the veil comes with being modest and has a religious significance, which she deeply believes in. However, growing up in a modern household causes her to experience the internal conflict of wanting to follow in her family's footsteps.
Conflicting classes is evident within the novel as well. As the novel begins, Marjane explains that her family has many different luxuries, such as a Cadillac and maid services, in which they were not allowed to eat with the rest of her family. She does not fully understand the reasoning why, and she attributes it to the reasons why she should be a prophet. However, this is the beginning of the theme of conflicting classes in which the audience gets a view of how the elite live and how the poor are treated.
Diving deeper into the issue of the maids, the audience sees firsthand that the elite see themselves as being bigger than them and do not even allow them to eat at the same table. We see this issue of servants not being equal with others in society again when Mary, the satrapy's maid, fell in love with the neighbor boy and had Marjane write letters to him for her each night.
Exactly, Jenna. And then when Marjane's father found out about the letters, he was displeased and he informed the neighbor boy that he had mistaken their maid for their daughter. Immediately, the neighbor boy handed over the letters he received from Mary, and he no longer wanted to speak to her. This once again portrays the fact that maids and servants were not seen as equals in society. The majority of maids are also not able to read or write.
The last large major theme in the novel is religion. In the United States, there is freedom of religion, but in Iran, this is not the case. The regime wants everyone to be a strict follower of Islam. Although Marjane is very religious and believes in God, she is also skeptical because she doesn't think that her faith depends on the amount of hair she shows through her veil.
This shows that Marjane believes in God but doesn't exactly believe in religion and customs and ceremonies. The book shows how true religion isn't portrayed but rather corruption and power because the regime is forcing people to show their belief in God. They care more about showing people they have power than they do about their actual religion.
Alright, let's talk about symbols. After reading the text, it appears that wine represents rebellion and defiance in Persepolis. Parties were banned in Marjane's country, and if patrols found out that they were drinking any type of alcohol, they would be severely punished. Because of this, many people living in Tehran held parties in secret, and Marjane's parents even went to the extent of pulling up dark curtains so their neighbors could not see them having people over and throwing a party.
Along with wine, the posters Marjane's parents by her also symbolized defiance and rebellion in Iranian culture. This is clearly displayed when the satrapies go to great lengths to disguise the posters in the lining of Marjie's father's overcoat in order to avoid punishment and get past customs in the airport.
Another major symbol in Persepolis is the key. The key essentially symbolizes the doomed fate of the poor, young boys being recruited for the war. They are given a key and told it was their key to heaven if they are lucky enough to die. The war recruiters try to make dying sound appealing by saying that there are beautiful women in heaven and great food, and insinuating that most of those who enter the war will eventually lose their life.
They even convince the young men that the afterlife is pleasant and they should be inevitably be happy to die. However, Marjane noted in the text that many boys did in fact lose their lives, saying the key to paradise was for poor people. Thousands of young kids promised a better life exploded on the minefield with their keys around their necks.
Wow, that is a lot of young boys that died throughout the war. Although this is very sad, at least the families of the boys can take comfort in knowing that their sons died with honor and protected their country.
I agree. Now finally, the last symbol we will be discussing is the veil. The veil symbolizes conformance to the Iranian government during the Islamic Revolution. As Marjane began to explain as the novel began, the veils caused confusion amongst the young girls, who did not truly understand what the veils meant and why they had to wear them. However, it was later explained that the Iranian government believed that the current bilingual schools were a symbol of capitalism, and they took it upon themselves to change the entire system so that the girls could only attend school with other girls and vice versa. These factors together caused outrage amongst the Iranian people, but they could not cause a lot of discourse because if they were caught, they would be greatly punished. Therefore, the veil got the ball rolling when it came to the Iranian people conforming to the new standards of the government.
While talking about symbols, we must also discuss a central motif in the novel, which is the appearance of God. In the beginning of the novel, Marjane saw God many times in her dreams. This parallels her deep religious faith and her desire to become the next prophet. We can see that she greatly relies on faith throughout her day-to-day life. However, as the novel continues, God appears less and less in her dreams, and at one point she says to God, "Shut up, you, get out of my life, I never want to see you again." This conversation occurred after the death of Marjane's uncle, Anush, who was executed for being a Russian spy. The death of her uncle clearly rocked her faith in God, and it caused it to crumble.
The use of language throughout the novel is very important. It has a very relatable narrative technique, in my opinion. Marjane is the narrator throughout the novel, and as the audience, we are able to experience the Islamic Revolution and Iraqi War through her eyes. Because she is approximately 12 years old, the dialogue and narration follow suit to cater to the language use of an adolescent.
I also enjoyed reading it from her perspective because she is able to appeal to the audience's emotions instead of just their political nature in order to tell her story. I found it easier to relate and sympathize to her than I would if I was hearing it from an older person's point of view. Through this, she is able to take us into her thoughts and see how she views the different aspects of the war. One example of this is when she describes and thinks about the different methods of torture used against prisoners of war. She hears that someone was tortured with an iron and sees an actual iron from an ironing board in her head. We also see how she believes prisoners are cut into pieces after being tortured.
It seemed a bit graphic viewing her pictures of it.
Yes, but that is how she envisioned them in her head as a young girl. There was no sugarcoating it. Another example of how we see her thoughts is how her friend Siamak and his family escaped from Islam. Marjane and her family find out that the family hid themselves amongst a flock of sheep to get across the border, and in Marjane's mind, she sees them actually crawling next to the sheep all the way across the border. While there is a chance this could have happened, chances are they were hidden in a vehicle of some sort that was traveling with the flock of sheep.
I would have probably visioned the events the same way in my head, even without her images. This graphic novel also provides a unique experience in that the audience is able to see the expressions and thoughts of Marjane through the images presented in the comic strips. Because of this, Marjane often uses expressive words such as wow and totally. Another unique aspect is that instead of having to express every time someone was confused by a certain situation, a question mark was inserted in the thought bubble above the character's head with no other dialogue. If this was a normal, strictly text-written novel, this would not have made sense. However, because the audience is able to see the situation at hand, the question mark is all that is needed.
An important part of this book is the use of space, settings, and time.
Throughout the book, the author uses the idea of time in a very unique way.
Yeah, as Margie tells the story, she sequences it in or of the events as they happened. Beginning in the 1970s, she watches as her family and fellow Iranians boycott against the hated Shah to have him removed and then defeated in 1979 and leaves.
And as she continues to grow, she watches as the new Iran, now ruled by Islamic fundamentalists, slowly goes into war.
She goes through a lot, but it is clear that as she grows, she becomes less afraid to stand up for what she believes in and begins to speak out against those in charge to the point that her parents end up sending her to Vienna in 1984 when she was just 14 years old.
The plot mainly follows her as she grows and explains the life events and as she experiences them. You only learn from small cues that her age is changing throughout most of the text by the use of phrases like a year later, in 1980, and things like that.
I like how she tells the story at a quick, childlike pace and doesn't mention her age too much, except for at the beginning and end of the novel.
Along with time, the use of space and setting in the plot of the story is also very unique. It helps give the perspective of the war and problems in Iran from an Iranian's point of view, which is not experienced often. As you read, you learn what it is really like to grow up in this type of environment in these situations. This type of plot helps the audience understand the life of an Iranian.
Margie also uses tone to help the reader understand her point of view as a young girl, giving it a sense of humor at times, but also keeping it serious enough to keep the reader entertained and informed on the important events that occur throughout the book.
I completely agree, Alicia. The tone of her writing begins with the innocence of being a young child and develops into the knowledge of a grown woman. The warmth of her tone makes it easy to relate and feel for her as she talks about the deaths of her family and friends. Next, we will discuss irony within Persepolis.
There are many ironic moments throughout Persepolis. A large one is when Margie's uncle Tahir is hospitalized and needs a surgery that can only be performed in England, but he can't leave the country unless the travel is approved. The director of the hospital, their former window washer, says, "We'll do our best. If God wills it, he'll get better. Everything depends on God." This is ironic because Margie's family does not believe in God, so why would they rely on him?
Also ironically, Tahir's passport arrived exactly on the day that he was buried. This shows that it was not God's will which caused him to pass away, but rather the lack of the director's knowledge which caused Tahir's untimely death.
Every novel always has room for some criticism, as all authors expect to get out of their work. I would say that this book is a very well written novel depicting the Iranian Revolution.
I'm going to stop you right there. Some may think that, but personally I believe there are some flaws with it, including use of time. The novel kind of jumps around with time and it can get a little confusing if you aren't closely following it. Margie's also glossing over a lot of topics that could have gone into more detail to explain what is happening in Iran more thoroughly.
Overall, this book is a very important book in the history of the Iranian Revolution. It shows war from a child's point of view, which is an unusual yet extremely effective way to present this story. This book was interesting because it was unconventional and easy to read and understand, which makes it engaging to its audience. So, I'm Alicia.
I'm Jenna.
I'm Aaron.
I'm Olivia.
And I'm Lindsay, and this is our culture cast on Persepolis, the story of a childhood.